Roughly an hour of useless Titanfall 2 facts. These are mostly about the campaign because I don't really play multiplayer. You can cause your weapon loadout icons to be incorrect if you change weapon but then melee right before the animation of switching to it. This can also create impossible loadout situations, like having the arc tool out with another weapon, or just having one of your weapons be completely missing. Once you switch weapons again, the icons correct themselves. Similarly, you can slightly bug out the camera on certain embark animations if you just melee right before embarking. This animation at the very start of Effect and Cause is quite funny, in that it gives you very brief movement before it actually starts. If you do it right, you can use this movement to get yourself stuck on the very edge of this ring's collision, where you never gain control and you just sit there in purgatory forever. In this same animation, assuming you don't move your mouse, your starting crosshair position will be slightly random each time, for some reason. There is a spot above this ledge that says VTOL landing. However, if you actually do a VTOL landing on it and disembark, you will become stuck forever. These drop pods that carry grunts in attrition can launch you into the sky, if you collide with one before it touches the ground. These turrets in the fold weapon aren't actually tall enough to shoot through the windows properly, so they have little dev textured booster seats. These dev textures are just barely visible from inbounds as well. The skybox on both Wargames and Angel City contains floating rainbow text that just says Mike, which can also be seen from inbounds if you stand in these locations. Although I can't really tell if it's actually supposed to be a mapper signature or if it's just another one of the weird bits of text that you can already find in these skyboxes, because the same model also appears on these two very non-hidden buildings, although it's been flipped the wrong way. Speaking of getting flipped the wrong way, this tall building that says Respawn is in this skybox 3 times, and in all 3 of those cases it gets flipped the wrong way. The Gauntlet's ghost run for L. Miller, once he gets to this section, will start holding his R201 as if it was a pistol. C. Dione also crosses an imaginary bridge between these 2 rocks, and if you watch Anderson's ghost at this part towards the end, he clips halfway through this wall. Also, Fukuda's ghost doesn't properly touch the end trigger. The game just treats the bonk on this wall as if it was the end of their run. For some reason, you can control Richter's cloak with your mouse during the cutscene where Lastimosa rescues you from the apex predators. If you left click at any time, you'll cause it to do this little puff outwards until you let go of the button. You can also do the same thing with other completely random objects in a few other cutscenes as well, such as this one wire on BT that sticks out whenever you shoot during this sequence. At the end of Beacon Chapter 1, once BT is already standing on this elevator, you can mantle these pipes and clip through the wall just far enough for the game to briefly think that you and BT are both inside the room, which causes it to close the doors and start the ending cutscene while you're still outside. If you do this, there's no way to ever get inside the room again, meaning you just softlock yourself once BT prompts you to go get the arc tool. If you stand on this railing in Abyss 2 and wait for a bit, you get perfectly scooped up by this little crane thing. The gauntlet does not actually form a complete loop. Once you reach the end of a run, the game just teleports you back into the staging area, which you can see pretty easily if you end a run while facing backwards. Building off of that same fact, you can actually still see this teleport happening at the end of GameSage's first place run, where the ghost flies off for a split second at the end before it disintegrates. This seems to have been cut from all the other runs though. Speaking of the gauntlet, the gauntlet start trigger is kind of broken and sometimes just fails to actually start a gauntlet run. When this happens, it never does the teleport at the end to complete the loop, and you can eventually just walk through this fake door and go straight out of bounds. This is more likely to happen to you the faster you're going through the trigger, so it's probably something to do with the frequency it checks for you, or just how physically thin it is. This same trigger can also be used to create a visual bug on basically any weapon in the game. All you need to do is empty out your clip, reload until you take out the magazine, swap weapons, and then go through the trigger to give you back full ammo on the empty gun. You can then use any weapon freely with their magazines taken out of the model completely. When these doors open after Anderson's log finishes playing out in Affecting Cause 2, you can see the grunts on the other side doing a T-pose for a split second. You can also find a pair of T-posing scientists quite easily at the start of the level. Beacon 1 has multiple oddities in its loading screen images. Firstly, the main loading screen, where you can see Beacon 3 in the background, is completely inaccurate to the actual level. In-game, the beacon is opposite the dish and is sat looking almost directly into the little platform run section, but in the loading screen, the beacon is sat next to the dish and completely perpendicular to the platform area. This loading screen also just uses a bit of Beacon 1's starting area as the base vantage point, so the beacon is technically also much further away and in the complete opposite direction from where it is in-game. Secondly, in this loading screen slightly later on, you can see the word easy in the bottom left corner. The likely reason this is here is that whenever you launch the game in developer mode, your current difficulty will be displayed in the bottom left at all times. And so whoever took this Beacon 1 screenshot in developer mode probably just forgot to get rid of this indicator. This is the same image that also gets used in the level select menu, so you can see a little white artifact in the corner there as well. And also they were playing on easy. Also, the background of the loading image for the fold weapon, if you can get past the blurriness, shows that they just use BT as a backdrop, which technically means Cooper crash landed in the exact same place twice in a row. In this same loading screen, Cooper is holding his hands in front of him as if they're supposed to be in handcuffs, but the handcuffs just don't exist. If you run ahead on this part of Trial by Fire, you can get a closer look at how these grunts actually arrive in this area, and you'll find that the sequence is not very well put together. The ship just flies off while the grunts are still in the middle of trying to use its zipline, which bamboozles them for a while. If you try to restart from the pause menu in Affecting Cause 3, it drops you off in the wrong level. This is most likely due to the fact that these levels are actually both the exact same maps internally, and just use different scripts. This same thing also happens with the Beacon chapters 1 and 3 for the same reason, but on there it fixes itself once you get far enough into the level. Presumably because they all use the same laser object, both the charge rifle and Ion's laser shot can act as arc tools, allowing you to activate any arc tool switch you want without actually needing one. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean you can complete Beacon 2 without ever collecting the arc tool, because an invisible wall at the end softlocks you. Also, if you laser shot the switch to activate this door, for some reason the game just instantly disembarks you. Combining these two facts, you can actually trigger quite a few Affecting Cause 1 and Beacon 3 sequences in the opposite level if you have good enough movement and either a charge rifle, which you can take from Affecting Cause 3, or out of bounds shenanigans. The most interesting thing that can happen here is the module grab animation bugging out and looking like this. Speaking of the arc tool, you can actually aim down sights with it, but it's such a minuscule amount of zoom it's barely even noticeable and basically only exists to slow down your walk speed a little bit for no reason. In the cutscene where Lastimosa first gives you control of BT, the line where he tells you to take care of him is completely missing in the Mandarin dub.
Use my helmet and my jump kit. This is the real thing. Take care of him.
用我的头盔和跳跃装备，这可不是玩玩的。
If you go really high up through this section in Abyss 2, you can skip the trigger that's normally responsible for switching around the level's environment art now that you're getting closer to it. The funniest effect of doing this is not only can you not activate the end fight, it also creates this giant building right in the middle of the dome assembly, although it isn't solid, so the building itself doesn't actually impede your progress. If you start taking Anderson's helmet without killing this prowler, it will simply be removed. If you do a particular series of disembark clips at the end of Beacon 3, you can stay outside with free movement during the entire ending cutscene. From here, if you have either ticks or fire stars, you can actually kill Sarah in the following BT cutscene, along with any of the grunts, and the game just rolls with it. Sarah is impervious to every other weapon in the entire game. There are triggers inside some of these plants in BT that can be activated when you crouch in them, and they make it so that enemies will never target you. Which plants have this trigger and which don't is quite arbitrary. There is an unused mechanic in the campaign called mobility difficulty, which can only be found by manually restoring it in a few lines in the scripts. If this system had made the final cut, it would have been able to make levels change to make certain movement sections easier or harder. For example, some of the octal switches on the return to BT in the beacon would have been removed on higher difficulties. There's also this huge bridge on Beacon 2 that you can normally never see, which shows that they likely originally intended the fan section to be entirely skippable on easier difficulties. After calling in your first Titan in the training mission, if you jump on top of the Titanfall indicator with decently precise timing, you can cause the Titan to drop in from a skewed angle. The angle it drops at is determined by your particular timing, ranging from a slightly diagonal angle all the way to a completely horizontal Titan jump scare. Also in this same Titanfall prompt, if you mash the button to call in the Titan fast enough, you can actually call in two at once, which causes one of them to instantly explode and the game automatically reverts checkpoint. And one last thing about this cutscene, a common fact people tell you is that the Titan you call in is FS1041, which is the same Titan you see at the end of the game before you put BT's datacore in it. However, it actually has the chassis of Sarah's Titan, and then once the simulation glitches out it switches to BT's chassis, both of which are inconsistent with its name indicator. Even lore-wise, this Titan is just a complete mess. In the run-up to the Sloan boss fight, you can clip through this wall and find a dev-textured ramp that runs up for a bit before ending suddenly. It's possible that this room was either extended or cut down from how it was originally designed. There is a very small detail on glitch that a lot of people might not realise exists. These rooms on either side of the map have this little mini-map in it that shows where all your friends are, and the icon in the top left corner of that map will change depending on which faction you have selected. However, this detail will break if you load directly into the map, which causes the icon to be shown as a missing texture since it doesn't know what faction you're in. In any of the effect and cause levels, if you interrupt a timeline swap with some other scripted animation, such as a rodeo or a panel hacking, or a roughly frame-perfect quick death trigger, you can cause the game to incorrectly track which timeline you're actually on, thereby completely freezing all the enemies in place. As a side effect of this, due to the timelines actually just being two different levels stacked on top of each other, switching timelines again in this state will cause you to get teleported way up into the heavens. As you can probably imagine, it's incredibly easy to get out of bounds with this. Also, speaking of effect and cause, in the first chapter, if you pre-trigger everything in the level on both timelines without actually causing any progression, and then go back to the lecture hall, It just gets filled with a bunch of random garbage. This is caused by having enough entities on the map at once, and so this is the only level in the game where it can realistically happen. Another thing exclusive to this level is that if you swap to the past while in between wall runs, you can grab onto the same wall twice in a row, even though the game usually requires you to be lower down on the wall for this to work. This works due to the Z positions of each timeline, as by time swapping specifically from the past to the present while in between wall runs, you're technically putting yourself below the point when you first grab the wall. For the same reason, during any of Anderson's audio logs, his little name tag above his head can be seen duplicated if you look straight up or straight down on either timeline. On only the PS4 version of the game, switching timeline in certain areas of Effect and Cause 2 sometimes causes this to happen.
That was awkward. Holy smokes, that was weird.
The leading theory is that the sound of a bullet hitting glass is getting copied over and over again and eventually gets really loud. In the scripts used for creating save files, this function is hard-coded to report that it was called on the 3rd of August 2016. If you manage to re-land on a bit of higher up geo while you're in the middle of doing a hover, you will be able to disembark during it. Doing this will give Cooper a roughly 15% permanent reduction in gravity, which will persist all the way until the end of the level, or until you hover again. You'll also find yourself defenseless if you do the same thing with a flight core and then re-embark quickly enough after doing it. In the very first cutscene of the game, as long as you haven't looked at any of the little calibration lights yet, Lastimosa will secretly be looping through the animation where he hits the sim pod in the background. If you take long enough to do the first light, you can see his hand clipping through the pod here periodically. Another tidbit about the calibration lights is that in order to check if you're looking at one of them, the game just gets the distance of your mouse in raw pixels. However, this means the amount you have to move your mouse for each light gets lower the lower your resolution is, and it also gets lower the higher your FOV is. At a resolution of 1024 by 768 in 4:3 aspect ratio, the activation ranges of the light starts to overlap, allowing you to register both of them at once. As well as this, at a resolution of 800 by 600, which is only accessible through launch parameters, you'll activate both lights instantly without even having to move your mouse at all. Thanks to this bug, it's possible to beat Titanfall 2 without ever moving your mouse. Also in this same place, but at the end of the level, you can get a glimpse of Anderson's gun as he walks by and does his thing with Lastimosa, where he appears to be holding a car SMG, evidenced by the texture and the foregrip, but with the length, magazine and iron sights of an R201. This gun is a complete fabrication of the mind and does not exist anywhere else in the game. These iPad things on the boost selection screen can actually be spun around if you drag them with your mouse. Also, all of the boost icons on this menu usually scale with your graphics settings, meaning they'll be super blurry on lower texture qualities, except amped weapons, which for some reason stays in pristine condition no matter what your graphics settings are. As well as this, the outside frames and back sides of every boost iPad is usually in the same high quality even on low settings. However, battery backup has a low quality backside as well as front side on low settings. And finally, Holopilot Nova has slightly bigger green circles on the front than every other iPad. Titanfall 2 has a hard speed cap of 12,100 units per second. If you were to start a slide hop and do constant perfect air strafing, it would take you just under 2 days to reach the speed cap. If you use a projectile weapon, you can sometimes randomly shoot through this breaching glass in the arc, and actually kill the people on the other side. If you kill every single enemy in the room before the 6-4 breaches the glass, the game crashes. If you switch off of Legion to any other Titan loadout and then immediately start coring, the game crashes. If you move really far away from the hub room on beacon 1 or 3, and then return fast enough, all of these doors will just completely vanish. However, if you try to go through any of them, the game crashes. If you get out of bounds in an area where you have a line of sight outside the map's geometry, and then shoot any hit scan weapon into the void, the game crashes. along with any multiplayer server you might have been on. Before the sludge arena fight, if you delay BT's dialogue for as long as possible, hit the button to start the fight, and then go up to this fence and embark BT before he gets done talking, the game crashes. If you fire the arc tool on around the exact same frame that you get teleported to the final Beacon 3 cutscene, the game crashes. If, instead of doing BT's fastball throw in the arc, you just damage boost over to the 6-4 ship yourself, and then touch BT's hand at any other later point in the level, the game crashes. If you get down to really low health in the Sloan fight, start pulling out the arc injector, die during the animation, but then continue pressing E to completion during the death fade out, the game crashes. If you manage to kill yourself in this hallway of affecting cause 1 while still hitting the trigger for the next scripted time swap beforehand, the game crashes. If you go through Beacon 3 without ever touching this zipline, play through to the end of the dish fight and then go back and touch the zipline, the game crashes. The damage penalty that you would normally get with split shots when you zoom in with the splitter rifle doesn't apply if you were already previously scoped in with some other ability, such as a laser shot or a vortex shield deflect, and then get auto switched onto the splitter rifle after using them. This ends up giving the splitter rifle a much higher DPS than was intended. If you use this glitch to kill Viper super quickly, the game crashes. This gunship in Abyss 3 behaves very strangely if you look at it without actually triggering the next part of the level. If you climb up this tower without having entered the Ash Arena yet, shoot down the gunship with a sniper, and then try to enter the Ash Arena, the game crashes. If you attempt to load into a single player save file during a multiplayer match, which you can do in vanilla using config binds, the game will wait all the way until the match is over before loading you into single player. Once you do load in, the game crashes. This one can also crash in many different ways depending on the single player save, an interesting one being a server is full crash, followed by your multiplayer button breaking and getting stuck on initializing forever. If you use a crane in Beacon 3 and then regain movement, which you can do using no-clip, pressing E at any point will teleport you back to the crane. This is pretty expected behaviour, however, if you do this and use your E press on another crane, you'll be able to move that crane while in normal gameplay, without any UI or animation. If you embark BT in this state, this happens. If you start a fastball sequence and press E at any point during it, this happens. There are a couple of different effects that can happen if you press E while rodeoing. If you try to hack a Spectre, this happens. And finally, if you press E during Richter's intro cutscene, he will get deleted from existence, and upon trying to make him speak, the game crashes. On Beacon 1, if you run ahead of BT at the start, kill all these stalkers as a pilot, return to BT and embark him before he starts warning you about the toxic fog, the game crashes. After killing Sloan, if you switch to Ronin and then use Sword Cord directly before interacting with the Arc Injector, you'll actually keep your weapon out during this cutscene. Once BT starts up, the weapon carries over to him as well, and for some reason the game just automatically puts him on Legion. From here you can actually shoot and kill Blisk and completely bug out the rest of the cutscene, skipping over all 36 seconds of his dialogue, and essentially fast forwarding to the next sequence. Also, if you do a melee attack during the transition between Pilot and Titan, the game crashes. This animation in the beacon where you fall off the dish and fumble your weapon on the way down is incredibly well programmed, as it has no problem accounting for every single weapon in the entire game, including Titan weapons, and even the cube map, which you can only give yourself in developer mode. However, if you start this animation with flight core rockets equipped, the game crashes. Speaking of this same cutscene, if before triggering it you get BT in a stuck state, which you can do on this little door frame, BT's locked movement carries over even in this scripted sequence, resulting in you getting saved from death by the hand of God, and then teleported back over to BT afterwards. If you use the Ronin client, the game crashes. Whenever you use Flight Core as Brute, it will incorrectly show your primary weapon as being the plasma railgun. This room in Affecting Cause 2 contains death triggers that are only active in one timeline. If you swap to the past right as you die, you just briefly teleport your dead body up to the death warp location. For some reason though, these triggers will become active and work as intended once you progress past this point. There's also another error in the death triggers in this part of Abyss 2, where Respawn left a small gap near this pipe and you can fall down and it just puts you straight out of bounds instead of killing you. Quite similarly to this, one of the funniest and easiest out of bounds in the entire game is this spot in Abyss 2, where you can literally just walk out of bounds and there's nothing that stops you. Captain Cole and McCord from the Beacon's hub room are internally referred to as Mike and Ike. The NPC named after Chad Grenier is likely supposed to also be a pilot in training, because he has an entry on the Gauntlet leaderboard despite being a grunt when you meet him in game. Even though you can find hidden Nessies in most of the other levels in the game, this one on the Ark is quite unique, in that it not only has a mapper signature next to it, but also plays this little dialogue line when you get close enough.
Nice work, Coop.
This dialogue is also attributed to SRS pilot Alavi in the top right, Alavi being the name of the level designer, Muhammad Alavi, although it's actually just a reused Davis line from earlier in the level. Speaking of mapper signatures, there's a cool one here on Complex. Also, the texture of the big Nessie from the Nessie Vault Easter egg contains the number 102814, which is most likely referring to the date, the 28th of October 2014. This is strange because October 28th is Titanfall 2's release date, but 2014 is the release year of Titanfall 1. If you go out of bounds after the Fold Weapon intro cutscene, you can find remnants of an unused sequence, where you would have watched the Apex Predators going up this elevator while carrying the Ark. Lastimosa's helmet flickering on in this cutscene is actually done by repeatedly switching his team between Militia and Spectator. If you use cheats to turn the camera around on the multiplayer menu, you can see the skybox that was used here for some reason just has Abyss 3 on it. After defeating Sloan and pulling out the Arc Injector, the game prompts you to start mashing the hell out of E. However, the number of times you press E has no effect on how the sequence plays out. Even if you only press it once, the result is the exact same. Speaking of the Arc Injector, the game actually allows you to attempt to interact with it before you've even defeated Sloan, and even gives you an alternate animation. It's impossible to actually do anything with this because pressing E any number of times will do absolutely nothing, and unless you back out, you'll just stay in this sequence until an enemy inevitably kills you. However, if you put Sloan on really low health, hit her with a damage over time ability like a Flame Trap or Electric Smoke, and then start pulling out the Arc Injector, after she eventually dies, the animation bugs out and gives you back control of BT, before the sequence plays out as normal. This elevator has a spot that eats Titans. If you put BT in this position and disembark around when you pass over this little ring, he will be sent to the underworld. If you use an electric smoke to trick Sarah into dashing into the same spot, she can also get eaten. This rock, which is the second to last platform that you stand on in the entire game, will become similarly evil if you slide on it for too long. In the ending segment of Affecting Cause where time freezes, if you turn around you can see BT running behind you, but only if you enter the sequence while embarked. If you triggered the sequence as Cooper, BT will not be there, even if he was there. Before you start this same sequence, if you melee this Reaper at the right time just before the whiteout, you'll eventually just randomly die during the cutscene, and upon respawning you'll briefly be given 3 arms. Normally, when you enter a private match with modifiers, like 500% core gain or health, these variables are reset once you leave the lobby, once the game puts you back on the main multiplayer screen here. However, this can be bypassed if you enter a match with these values set, exit back to the lobby, leave the lobby, and then quickly accept the follow-up prompt, where it asks you if you want to go all the way back to the main menu. Doing this will allow you to play with the really high core gain and health in the campaign, as the variables are retained into single player. For some unknown reason, the 500% health only works on affecting cores chapters 2 and 3 though. If you put these developer flags in your launch options, you can access the leftovers of Respawn's campaign developer menu. Most of these options don't work, but the most notable thing that does is the developer start points, which all take you into various places in the campaign. There are a few developer start points for the Ark that are unused and crash the game. However, this one, containing a sequence with Droz piloting the Malta, which was recorded as part of the campaign trailer, is still functional. The dev start point for the start of the fold weapon also takes you to a slightly broken version of the intro cutscene, where certain audio doesn't work and the timing of events and dialogue is broken.
是啊，小队就是这样，要不一起赢，要不一起死。小心，干掉他！
让我把他给撕了。
The Gauntlet also has some hidden developer checkpoints that would have presumably been used to record the Ghost Gauntlet runs. These start points function identically to the usual Gauntlet map, with the exception of this weird washed out lighting that kind of resembles the lighting from the tech test, no Lastimosa to progress the level with, and you can't damage any of the targets in the gun range. A good chunk of these ghost templates also have placeholder names. Finally, there are some unused single-player style levels, the most interesting of which being OLA Sewer, Lavaland, and Gravesky, with the description Gravesky damaged. These were most likely just used for testing, but none of the maps exist anymore, so we don't know what they would have been. At the end of the Titan tutorial in BT, if you hold E to disembark and then re-embark at the earliest possible point after the game gives you movement back, for some reason you'll be locked out of dashing and your dashes will no longer charge up. However, the dashes will start charging up while you're disembarked from BT, but again you can't actually use them. Also, if you do a melee attack in this state, your primary weapon gets replaced with this placeholder fist icon, which can never usually be seen anywhere else in the game, and your left click just gets replaced with a Titan punch that does 0 damage. There are multiple cases in the campaign where certain enemy spawns just never happen if you take a specific path through somewhere. For example, in Trial by Fire, if you go through this right side area, the final pair of Titans at the end never spawn. A few of the more impactful examples of this are in the second half of the fold weapon, where if you go high enough next to this little rocky bit, the entire squad of Titans that you normally fight in the next section never drop in. And not long after that, if you hug the left wall over this rock as you enter the final Titan clear, not only will none of the Titans spawn in, but the music will also be incorrect during the Sloan fight afterwards. This enemy Titan voice line has this leftover bit in brackets that says grit your teeth a bit through this one, which seems like directions for the voice actor that just never got removed. You can eject from BT in vanilla if you bind something to Titan Eject 3 in your config. In most cases, this just reverts you to checkpoint too quickly to do anything. However, there are multiple silly events that can take place if you eject during cutscenes. The campaign smart pistol from after you've inserted BT's data core is unable to shoot while sprinting, but every other version of the smart pistol can. This even includes the one you get from the Seer kit, but it just magically loses the ability to do this once you insert the data core. There's a bunch of coloured cubes just chilling out of bounds here in BT, and while they do emit this weird lighting on high enough graphic settings, meaning they could be some kind of lighting test, as far as I can tell they do absolutely nothing. Speaking of doing absolutely nothing, there's a trigger here in the beacon called Trigger Nessie, and as far as we can tell it does absolutely nothing. There is also a completely random unhidden light blocker underneath this part of affecting cause, which judging by this script seems like it might have originally been moved up once you start the third chapter to change the lighting around this doorway. But this functionality went unused, and so now it just sits here and does absolutely nothing. If you're on Legion and do a power shot, but then switch to a different loadout before the power shot has a chance to actually happen, it will put you in a weird state where no matter what you do you're completely locked out of meleeing, and your sword core ability will be completely bugged out and will start doing absolutely nothing. There is a floating out of bounds button in the past timeline of affecting cores 1 and 3, however pressing it in either level does absolutely nothing. Towards the end of affecting cores 2, after dropping down the long time swap event, there's this small window of time where your weapon gets taken away and you can't move, as the game sets you up for the landing animation. It's possible, if you enter the vent in just the right way and get swished around like this, to actually miss the floor and land on top of this little raised thing instead, where the landing animation never starts and you're just stuck in this state forever. If you get a checkpoint as this happens, you'll retain the state in the checkpoint as well, soft-locking you in this kind of eerie checkpoint where you just sit there with no weapon staring out of this window forever, doing absolutely nothing. There are 2 spots in the walls of the dome arena that have missing collision that you can crouch through. From this location, you can also skip the entire rest of the level and just load straight into Abyss 3, if you sit there for long enough doing absolutely nothing. There's a bunch of spots where you can just get stuck falling infinitely and doom yourself to an eternity of doing absolutely nothing. At the start of Blood and Rust, there's this one completely lone grunt that gets airdropped in on this little cube sitting just out of bounds, and there is no way of interacting with him at all without glitches or cheats, meaning nobody knows why he exists, he just sits there and does absolutely nothing. This also means it's secretly impossible to get true 100% kills on Blood and Rust without using glitches or hacks. There are 2 Titan batteries sat in slightly different positions underneath this floor in both timelines of affecting cores 1 and 3. They are both completely inaccessible without hacks, so they just do absolutely nothing. You can also just look up and behind you after starting the time freeze section and find 2 other inaccessible Titan batteries, BT himself, and an audio log outline just chilling on the ceiling. The 2 batteries very specifically appear once you reach a certain part of affecting cores 3, but as far as I can tell they do absolutely nothing. In the Beacon 3 reactor room, even though the game tries to make it seem really urgent, you're actually completely invincible and can never fail it in any way. If you wanted to, you could literally just sit here and do absolutely nothing. Speaking of the reactor room, all of the environment art for it was apparently based off of an incorrect assumption of the scale of the image that was being used as a reference. The level designer used this image of a fission reactor, but only realised way later that that reactor would never actually fit somebody inside it, like it does in the game. If you're playing on controller and are using either a custom control scheme or the Ninja control scheme, any dialogue option popping up in-game will cause it to drop whatever inputs are currently being held down. This affects things like pull grenades, aiming down sights, and crouching if you use hold to crouch. The Thunderbolt's projectiles are just mini arc models. Also, the breaching charges on the arc are just North Star tether traps. If you dump out an entire L-Star magazine, wait for the part of the reload animation where you put a new magazine in, and then melee, jump and crouch at the exact same time, you'll get this little animation on the screen where it does a startup sequence, errors out, and then says, "Let the hamsters go free." This screen will persist forever, even through level transitions. There are quite a few bugs in cutscenes that can be seen if you play on the max FOV, likely due to the fact the game was never tested on any FOV above 70. For example, during the fold weapon intro cutscene, you can see Bliss do a somersault, run away, freeze in place, and then drop through the floor. Also, in the opening to the arc, you can see BT wave at you in the sky, wave at you again, disappear off into heaven, and then just immediately drop right in front of you. Also, in the animation where you pick up the Seer kit, you can see Cooper putting a knife on top of his already existing knife. In Ash's boss fight intro, you can still see the pilot model levitating in the air while the Titan is phase dashing. In the very first cutscene, you can see an R201 stock just kind of floating and sticking out next to you, despite the fact you don't even have an R201 in that level. And in the Trial by Fire intro, after your Titan drops, you can just about see the invisible box in the sky where the previous part of the cutscene took place. Also in the Arc intro cutscene, once the ship starts tilting backwards like this, it's pretty easy to clip through it and end up inside the ship's hull for the rest of the sequence. The Gauntlet's time spent in high speed stat stops tracking once you get up to about 107 km an hour, and there is a section of code in the game that's specifically meant to do this. During your approach to the Ark as it's about to explode, if you swap to the present, you can see these floating grunts and zip lines in the sky. These are actually just the unloaded gunships that normally start flying in on the opposite timeline. If you get full core, switch to brute, switch off brute, and then immediately use your core, you can get infinite flight core rockets that will stay as your weapon forever until you switch loadouts again. On Beacon 2, there's this completely random spot on this wall where if you touch it, you just get pushed away instantly. But doing this also gives you really weird Mario World 5 movement, where you'll press a direction and then just slide across the room, and even upstairs at a constant speed. If you enter the fan launch after doing this, you don't get any of the scripted momentum, and it just feels like it's in slow motion, but after a while it does fix itself along with all the weird movement properties. Also, this grate that shoots out of the fan is extremely funny. BT is actually programmed to infinitely repeat his second throw onto the dish in Beacon 3 if you fall back down. However, you would never normally see this because there are death triggers all over the place that just teleport you to safety anyway. In fact, if you do trigger this failsafe using hacks, BT just throws you straight into a death trigger. In the Arc gun clear section, even though the 6.4 tells you to take out all of them, you actually only need to take out one of the 3 gun batteries. The first and second guns do not need to be cleared in order to activate the hangar fight. Similarly, as long as you've cleared at least the first wave of Titans on Trial by Fire, this door will eventually take pity on you and open on its own, if you stand in front of it without progressing for 12 seconds straight. There's a spot in the Beacon's hub room on this little ledge that can break the Chapter 1 ending cutscene if you disembark on it. You can reach it by hovering as the elevator starts ascending, and it will cause BT to get stuck forever in a silent idling animation. However, Cole will still continue playing out his side of the conversation normally, even though he's just getting dono-walled. For reasons yet unknown, ending a level will, in very rare circumstances, just show a huge missing texture as the loading screen image. There is a completely stationary gunship underneath the Draconis in this cutscene that you would normally never see. However, if you wait without going down the hatch for a really long time, since the Draconis is going down, the ship eventually clips straight through the floor and just floats up into the sky. The other half of BT, during this cutscene where he's been cut in two, is just stretched down and stored underneath the floor, along with this Legion minigun for some reason. These will both start moving with BT when he starts talking to you, and so if you look behind you during this dialogue, you'll see the minigun float up straight through the floor and then suddenly disappear again. If you get to the point where you're about to insert BT's first battery, run ahead without inserting it and go through the whole battery 2 section, return to BT, insert the battery and then do battery 2 again, you'll eventually get stopped by this broken bit of debris where half of its model just isn't there. You can infinitely delay BT from throwing this zipline if you just never look at him. There is a trigger at the very end of Trial by Fire that, when hit, just ends the level a little bit earlier than normal. The reason this trigger exists is revealed by the name of the vscript function it's tied to, which is called cbadgeo failsafe. In other words, Respawn didn't want you to see all this ugliness further up the launch area, and so the level just fades out before you can get a good look at it. Even though most of the internal dev names for levels aren't too interesting, there are multiple cases where the developer name for a level ended up being reused for the multiplayer map based on it. For example, Boomtown for Into the Abyss, and Crash Site for BT. Trial by Fire is also called T-Day in the files, which likely stands for Titan D-Day. The Ark uses the acronym S2S, which means ship to ship, and the fold weapon is called Skyway. Another funny thing is all the levels have developer descriptions as well, however most of them are like one word long and don't actually explain what the level is at all. My favourite ones are Organic Wall Run, Power Tech, and High Altitude, but not on the Ark. Trial by Fire is simply described as the promise of the premise, which honestly goes hard as fuck. Although you can never actually see it in-game, all of the Colosseum maps have this funny dev texture skybox. There is a ton of unused script functionality in a lot of levels. A few of the more interesting ones are this cut set piece involving crawlers and turrets in Abyss 1, the Titan arena in that level also moving and rearranging itself multiple times, freeing prisoners and experimentation subjects in affecting cores, and record saluting you as you walk by in the Beacon Hub Room cutscene. The very first platform cycle in Abyss 2 is a bit less polished than the rest, and once it gets to the main factory area, it just goes straight through this other crane. There's a pretty big gap in this wall in Abyss 1 where you can see out of bounds. If you get crushed by the IKEA display furnitures in this spot, your dead body also gets launched out of the map. Since they had to get around so many engine limitations, pretty much all of the Ark's backdrop just uses a rendering illusion, combined with a huge conveyor belt system that keeps all the entities in the center of the map. This can actually be seen in-game if you kill Viper really quickly, but not quickly enough to crash the game. The conveyor belt will fail to catch up with you properly, resulting in this Viper cutscene carrying you out of bounds. Unfortunately, the huge box still catches up with you eventually, and starts pushing you off the side of the map, meaning unless you manage to mantle clip back in bounds, you're kinda just stuck here. If you were to time your Viper kill really poorly, you can gain control while inside the invisible wall, which puts you in an infinite death loop. There is a QR code embedded in the corner of the loading screen image for affecting cause 1. You can't actually scan it from here because it gets cut off at the bottom, but the same QR code appears in all places where this texture appears in-game, and you can scan it from one of those places, such as this hatch on the Ark. And when you do, it just goes to Titanfall.com. Kind of a missed opportunity, to be honest. Also, sometimes this hatch just kills you for absolutely no reason. Also, the room below the hatch is actually fake. You're really being teleported into an alternate replica of the hatch, where the rest of the cutscene then plays out in Purgatory. Also, the dome at the end of Abyss 2 is also fake. You're really being teleported into an exact replica dome suspended way up in the sky when Respawn thinks you aren't looking. The simulation pod in the gauntlet is also secretly really tiny and just uses an optical illusion. Also in the dome arena, normally these background hexagons are supposed to glitch out when you shoot them, but the EVA 8 shotgun does not trigger this effect. In the part of Abyss 2 where you get carried to the dome on this platform for like 3 weeks, if you climb up and switch to any other platform that's sitting upright, they'll eventually just carry you straight out of bounds and drop you off in the middle of nowhere. All the platforms that aren't upright have no collision. The execution animations for boss titans aren't actually chosen based on which enemy you execute, but rather which level you're playing on. If you spawn a boss titan and execute them on a level that doesn't have an animation assigned to it, it will default to this very broken first-person execution taken from Titanfall 1. Interestingly enough, Blood and Rust actually does have a working execution assigned to it, even though you can never normally execute Cain in that level. Also, even if you execute bosses like Richter and Sloan normally, it's very easy to glitch out their animations without even really trying. At the end of Trial by Fire, there is a seemingly random chance that for whatever reason, you'll see this brute flying towards the Ark at light speed. This brute isn't used in the cutscene, so we really don't know why this happens. The entire backside of this column in Effect and Cause 2 magically disappears when you go up these stairs, revealing that it does just use the Stalker panel asset, and therefore secretly has unactivated Stalkers inside it. Even though it's usually impossible for you to die anywhere in the training mission, since the game always just floors your HP to 1, if you drop a grenade on one of the teleport triggers and have it touch an adjacent wall and then fall on top of it, for some reason that does kill you. There's also another way of dying in the gun range if you land on a very precise part of this floor, around where the two horizontal and vertical teleport triggers intersect. At just under 10 minutes, the gauntlet's timer freezes. However, it does secretly keep tracking well past that. The actual timer, along with the entire wall animation behind it, freezes at 8070 minutes, 46 seconds, and 500 of God's own milliseconds, which is about 5.5 days of real time. By the time you reach this point, the server will also be suffering quite heavily from decimal precision loss, meaning there will be many other jank side effects. Although it's impossible to actually see it without hacks because of the copious amounts of teleport triggers, there's a bunch of random shit floating around outside the map in the gauntlet. For example, this little white arena platform thing. Not one, but two different unused skybox elements, including these mountains and this funny floating sphere, as well as the starting cutscene area. The platform thing I mentioned earlier seems like it could be remnants of the same iteration of the map as the floating sphere thing, which is also evidenced by the fact that once you reach the Titan tutorial part of the mission, a duplicate Lastimosa will appear sitting on the white platform as well. This is the only level in the game with this amount of unused out-of-bounds oddities. A close contender, however, is the Ark, which sports Purgatory, a parallel universe filled with what could potentially be stored entities that are no longer in use, and this really beautiful moving 3D skybox. Once you progress enough in the level, the parallel universe will have weapon racks on it, and the guns on those racks will correspond with whatever weapons you place on certain racks in the actual level, which is the main reason for the whole entity storage theory. As a final quick out-of-bounds quickfire round, the start cutscene area of Wargames exists below the map. Pretty much everything that gets used in the end credit cutscenes, like the fleet of ships, the window with this helmet, the ship interior, and this little tree platform, are all floating underneath the fold weapon rings. Drydocks has this little guy who's probably showing enemy detection ranges, as well as a singular 1x1 dev cube sitting quite far away from the actual map. Blood and Rust has these things, as well as a few stationary gunships used for scale reference. Multiple of the live fire maps have these decently sized dev texture cubes sitting at varying distances away from the arena, etc. If you restart a level at the exact same time that you hit a quick death trigger, you'll sometimes re-enter the level facing the wrong direction. This will remain the case on every subsequent level restart, and you can only fix it by going all the way back to the main menu and starting the level from mission select. If you get this bug, it sometimes also just kind of corrects itself at seemingly random times later in the level, causing you to get a little stutter like this. If you load into Abyss Chapter 1 as one of your first level loads in a session, for some reason the game will just completely take away your mouse for a couple seconds at the very start of the level. If you drop a frag in front of yourself just before starting the sequence where you embark BT for the first time, you can watch BT pick up your dead body and put it in his chassis in the third person. If you execute a grunt in the final Ark cutscene, sometimes they will just be completely unfazed by the execution, and will then walk around neutrally while also becoming impervious to all damage. The two halves of Anderson's body don't actually line up at all. Also, Anderson's ammo pack has a little smiley face on it. If you were to get set on fire, start performing a time swap and then get a checkpoint at the exact same time the time swap takes effect. Upon reloading the checkpoint, you'll just be stuck getting set on fire by absolutely nothing. This can only be fixed by standing in the fire again. Also, if you time swap at the same time as hitting certain quick death triggers, you can gain movement for a brief time during the death blackout. This isn't usually that interesting of an effect, but if you do it right in front of the final fin in Effect and Cause Chapter 2, this will happen. If you get a checkpoint at the same time as a mantle, upon loading the checkpoint you'll be a decent amount shorter than normal. This will persist until you crouch. If you get a checkpoint that both sticks you inside the floor and also has you wall running at the same time, very silly shenanigans will commence. If you sit on top of this plant for long enough, the game eventually pushes you straight through the floor and out of bounds. Ronin's sword block usually absorbs 70% of incoming damage. However, if you simply look down, for some reason this increases to about 90%. The highest possible damage reduction you can get is 94%. This comes from getting an 80% damage reduction from being doomed on easy, followed by a multiplicative 70% damage reduction from using sword block. In the Viper boss fight, if you punch one of the enemy Scorches on low enough health while they're close enough to the edge of the ship, they're scripted to fall off the side and instantly die with this goofy little animation. Doing this will sometimes cause a BT ragdoll to just kind of appear in front of you, and the game disables your weapon and locks your movement, forcing you to float off into the sunset. You don't float off forever though, and if you just switch loadouts, the game gives you your weapons back, albeit with really bad accuracy. If you manage to finish off Viper and end the fight in this state, the disembark you're prompted with afterwards still works, and appears to fix everything. However, at this point you're secretly just nothing more than a floating camera with arms. You can still enter the Viper kill sequence, but other than that you're unable to hit any triggers or die. For example, you can go off the side of the map and just chill under the death floor. When you try to progress down this hatch, you won't trigger the teleport that usually happens here, thereby soft-locking yourself in this fake hallway with these 3 grunts perpetually running and being teleported back. Also, you can punch any of these grunts as they're teleported and you'll teleport along with them. If you have auto sprint disabled, sprint forward by holding shift, pause the game, let go of shift and then unpause. It looks like this, and the first shot with your weapon after doing this will also be silent. This also happens with Titan loadout swapping, where it's way easier to do it by accident. On only the PC version of Titanfall 2, if you both pause the game and tab out of it at the exact same time, upon tabbing back in, you'll have the pause menu open, but the game will keep running in the background. This also works both with the Titan loadout menu and in reverse, giving you a frozen game with no pause menu. Unfortunately, this fixes itself as soon as you select any of the menu options, so it isn't really useful for anything. A QA tester at Respawn revealed that when BT froze you in Beacon 3, there is a tiny window in which you can input a jump off his hand hitbox. This window can also just be met for free if you hold jump the entire time. If you use this to fly over this part of Beacon 3, and then touch this quick death trigger, the game incorrectly spawns you at the start location of Beacon 1. The game hasn't set a death warp location yet, and since this is the same map as Beacon 1 internally, it defaults to this broken start point. Unless you know what you're doing, this is pretty much a soft lock. This whole section of the ship when you're collecting the first battery in BT is completely unnecessary, as it just loops you all the way around to this little crawl space. The same crawl space can be accessed directly from here if you just turn left. On incredibly rare occasion, upon setting a checkpoint, something can cause the size of your player's bounding box, which is the box used for movement detection, to be written into the save file as all zeros. Once you load this save file, since the client doesn't know this is happening but the server does, it puts you in a very weird state where movement is really stuttery. You can also get stopped by tiny inclines, you can only grab walls that are on the left side, and you can skew through almost any other collision in the game. You can temporarily fix your bounding box if you crouch. This effect has been dubbed glitch state, and the conditions needed to get a broken checkpoint load are theorized to be so precise it's basically impossible to replicate consistently. In Effect and Cause 1, if you punch one of these stalkers at the exact same time as the scripted time swap, you'll be teleported up into the ceiling, and if you do it right, you can re-enter this little hole that you usually fall down. If you kill Sloan extremely quickly, the fold weapon will sometimes already be fully charged up during this ending cutscene, and it'll just shoot you out instantly as soon as you select the dialogue option. Normally the game would make all these lights turn on one by one first. The exact reason this happens is still pretty much unknown, but it has something to do with the fold weapon never misfiring, and only happens if this 97% dialogue plays after you start pulling out the arc injector. Also in the fold weapon, it's possible to get out of bounds and then go through the level's triggers in reverse order. If, after reaching the point where you call down BT, you go all the way to the end of the level to the Sloan cutscene area, and then go back and insert the data core, you'll get a glitched cutscene where Sloan just stands there doing nothing. After a while the game sometimes crashes. If you were to reload the game after this crash, however, you'll actually get access to the fight after waiting long enough, where you can kill and execute a frozen Sloane, and also mess around with this invincible Blisk. He does react to incoming projectiles and Titan abilities, and if you get him on these stairs, his legs start to look extremely funny. Unfortunately, there is no way of actually progressing the level from here. There is a slice of pizza on the other side of this grate on Blood and Rust, which could possibly be a TMNT reference. In the very first gameplay section of the fold weapon, there's a small window of time where your jump kit is recharging and you're stuck with grunt movement only. If you were to die during this window, the jump kit never continues recharging, and you're just stuck forever with grunt movement. Since you don't have a double jump or wall running, this will eventually softlock you. At the start of BT, you can see this drop pod that's scripted to fly in from the right and kills you on contact. This drop pod is quite funny though, as it will somehow maintain its platform velocity even after it's long stopped moving. This allows you to perform silly shenanigans such as this. The double take, despite the name, actually has 3 different vaults that get shot out. The third one is just invisible. In Apex, Respawn decided to make the third bolt visible again and rename the gun to the triple take to avoid confusion. Around the first battery collection point in BT, for some reason the way these barrels roll out when you go through the ship is different depending on whether or not you have previously loaded a save file at any other point in the level. It is possible to duplicate the number of times Scorch's flame traps get ignited. All you need to do is have them ignite with the flame shield while they're outside of your field of view, which causes the game to retry igniting them multiple times for whatever reason. There are also a couple more methods of doing this that cause them to duplicate many more times, but they all involve very particular kinds of vertical geo. The 2 scripted staggering animations on the arc can be skipped if you hit really good B-hops. You can also execute someone during a stagger, and it looks like this.
Of course. Yes. That's definitely how the game's supposed to work.
You can quite easily see an untextured side of this wall in Beacon 1 and 3. Mouse and keyboard players can't look around during the final cutscene of the game, but controller players can. You can infinitely die in this area near the start of Abyss 3. And finally,
Whoa.